Hello everyone and welcome back to our fourth episode of our Bdsm podcast at Queer Disrupt. Today we are joined by Dr Emma Sheppard, who is a brilliant sociologist at Coventry University. She is here talking to us today about BDSM and what I'm going to broadly define as the disabled community, heavy quotation marks around that. But we look around crip theory, we look around people who engage with kind of BDSM and having chronic pain, and how do people from more marginalised spaces kind of engage with this space. Just a quick reminder on this one, we have the survey up and running, so please click on that, give us a go, let us know your thoughts as the season's going on, and then of course afterwards as well. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I've enjoyed kind of recording it, as well as all of our other episodes. So if you haven't caught up on that, the first episode is called The Butter Knife. The second one is called We're All Pay Pigs and the Abuse of Capitalism. And the third one is called Allergic to Bad Kink. This one, as I'm sure you're probably aware if you've clicked on it, is called Spanking on the NHS. Who knew that could be a treatment, eh? Well, let's listen and find out, and I hope you enjoy. Hello everyone, and thank you all for coming back to episode 4 of this new season that we're doing for the Queer Disrupt podcast. If you've listened to our previous episodes, brilliant. If you haven't, go back and listen to them. And we will hopefully be building on some of the themes that we touched on in those previous episodes. And I am joined today by the fabulous and the incredible Dr Emma Sheppard. So I'm going to pass over to her and let her introduce herself. So over to you.
Hiya. My name's Emma Sheppard. I'm a lecturer in sociology, as the official title goes. I work in an area called Disability Studies, particularly on chronic pain and BDSM.
So I'm hoping then that there's, for those of you who have listened, you can see the connections that are kind of drawing on the previous episodes. So I guess the very, very first question for you, as someone who is not an expert in this kind of field, is could you just kind of explain to me what you mean by these kind of connections? What does looking in disability studies, what is that? Tell us what that is in a few sentences, if you can. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so disability studies is essentially, if we can think about the kind of broader arguments around, for example, we have queer studies or gender studies. Disability studies is looking at disability, how it is socially constructed, produced, thought of. It's an interdisciplinary area that encompasses everything from what does it mean to be autistic to how do we support students at various levels of schooling, and should we have separate schools for disabled people or not? It's a really broad area, but it basically, what does it mean to be disabled?
So could you just clarify for me, because a lot of what you said there, perhaps for the person like myself who isn't in the know, for want of a better phrase, a lot of what you said there sounded quite kind of practical, quite kind of procedural. So use the question that you asked there about what it means to be autistic. Are we talking there in terms of like a very kind of medicalised view, or are we talking more, you mentioned about schools, that sounds very kind of policy, social or governmental. Does this branch out into other areas? Because I know, for example, there's queer theory and gender theory. Is there such a thing as a kind of a disability theory for people?
Yeah, so we can kind of think about, sometimes it does encompass the very practical stuff, and it does include policy, but it also can be quite, it engages with performance, literature, film, everything from kind of what's quite often called lived experience. So it's really prioritizing and focusing on the voices of disabled people and centering them in whatever research is done. But it's also very often if there's one unifying point, it is a rejection of a medical approach to disability. So it's very much thinking that in some aspects we can think about medicine as a useful tool or something that we may or may not have to engage in, but quite often it's thinking about how disability is more than just medical, and in some cases kind of very much deliberately speaking back to that medical establishment and that medical understanding of disability. And yes, when it comes to disability theory, there is such a thing, although much like gender theory or queer theory, you might want to pluralize it in disability theories. A lot of my work sits in an area which is known as crip theory. Crip as in the shorter form of cripple. It very much takes its cues from queer theory. So we use the word crip as a reclaiming of a pejorative term. So it's a positive identity. And crip theory is essentially looking at the binary of disabled and non-disabled, or how we can deconstruct that, but also to think about how expectations of disability and in particular non-disabledness run through our everyday life. So I teach queer theory, and one of the things that one of the first ideas we come across is compulsory heterosexuality. We can also think about the idea of compulsory ableness. So the default setting, as it were, of the world is to be non-disabled, but that's also considered to be the ideal. So it's not just about assuming that people are, it's assuming that that's what people want to be. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Thank you. It reminds me, and I've probably got the terminology wrong, but is that basically the social understanding of disability? And there's a kind of a theory around that.
No, I was going to say, so there is something called the social model of disability, which is slightly different to crip theory, and some proponents of the social model really don't like queer theory and crip theory because it gets a bit too messy and involved with sex.
Could you a quick breakdown just for our listeners what the key differences are briefly, if that's okay?
Yeah, okay. So social model of disability is quite old. I say quite old. It originates from the 1970s. And it's a really, really simple and straightforward way of understanding disability. We split disability into two factors, two halves. The first is impairment. And I quite often explain it as the answer to the question, what's wrong with you? It's a medical definition. Then the other half of that is disability or disablement. And that is the social barriers and attitudes that create disability. The classic example is a wheelchair user needs to access a building and there's a set of steps. They are perfectly mobile within their wheelchair until they come up against a set of steps. And at that point, they become disabled by the social attitude and expectation that people are going to be able to walk up a set of steps.
Yeah, they're very able, but the thing that is disabling them is the fact that there are steps. Not them, it's what society has dictated as a social norm that is influencing them there. Brilliant. Okay.
Yeah.
So how does that differ from crip theory? Sorry.
Crip theory is messy, for want of a better phrase. It is much more about deconstructing the binary of disabled and non-disabled, and it can sometimes also be about deconstructing that binary between impairment and disability. So one of the big questions that comes up is it's quite easy to see what the social process is when you have a set of stairs. But when it comes to something like chronic pain or chronic illness, cystic fibrosis, any kind of disability that might include bodily fluids that is painful or is quite often is genetic as well, or there's no easy to define reason. Where do we draw the line? What creates disability? How do we become disabled when we've got chronic pain? It's not about social attitudes or particularly the built environment. So it's thinking about the much more untidy questions about that, but also is about thinking about how disability and ability or ableism intersects with other identities like the racialized body or gendered or sexed bodies as well. The social model tends to kind of sit on its own. Crip theory is a bit more engaging with social identity.
Okay, that's really helpful. In my mind, and perhaps this is, I'm sure this is a very simplified version. In my mind, it feels like the difference is equivalent of kind of second wave feminist theory with queer theory. Okay, cool. Okay, I've got a pitch on that now, I think.
One of the things that's quite useful to kind of think about is again, And you saying about second wave feminist theory reminds me of thinking about where the social model came from. Its origins are, and this is fairly known history, an organisation called the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. They're no longer active, but they originally a group of Marxist social theorists who also happened to be white men who were wheelchair users. So they had a particular way of looking at the world.
So it was a wonderfully diverse group, obviously.
Yes, very, very diverse.
Of course.
And it's particularly noticeable when you just see the acronym UPS. But when you hit physically impaired against segregation, what they were basically saying is they didn't want to be lumped in with people with learning disabilities.
Oh, sorry, for those who can't see, I pulled a face there. I know this is a podcast, but I was on mute. But
I'm just nodding along, going, yeah, that
the face I pulled there was one of abject kind of horror and disgust. Wow,
it's a messy one.
That's an understatement, I think. Yeah.
So and on top of that, I kind of feel I can't go further without mentioning that within disability studies there has been, and there continues to be, let's just go with it, transphobia. There's quite a vocal, established transphobic voice and voices, particularly within British disability studies. And some of the rejection of crip theory comes about the fact that crip theory is a queer theory with bells on sometimes, but also happily engages with trans people. So one of the things that we frequently gets discussed within disability studies and disability activism is the place of trans and gender non-conforming people within disability.
So although I was kind of making that comparison earlier to second wave feminism, I guess it actually is a really apt comparison in certain ways, isn't it then?
Yeah, we definitely have our radical feminist and our
TERFs and SWERFs
members, as it were.
Okay. I was super interested in you talking about pain and that kind of the chronic pain, because you obviously mentioned about the go-to example a lot of people use, the wheelchair user and the steps, right? There's a very kind of visibleness to that kind of particular scenario. But obviously with something like, and I'm just using an example of no doubt myriad examples, chronic pain as a more invisible, for want of a better phrase, kind of internalized experience that a lot of people have. What I wanted to think about with you, if that's okay, is how does, for example, living with chronic pain, looking through a crip theory lens, perhaps, how does that change the way that we as listeners here, but also as researchers and just thinking people, how does that change the way we can kind of shape and see and understand and I guess ask all of those messy questions about pain and that negotiation of pain?
So while you were asking that question, one of the things that occurred to me is sometimes the use of the phrase invisible disabilities. Sometimes I like to use the phrase, rather than invisible, although I use it a lot, it is also undocumented. And it's a deliberate word choice by a researcher called Anna Mollo, who is writing particularly about, in this case, she was writing about the ways in which disability interacts with gender, particularly, to think about how we do or don't necessarily recognize something as disability or recognizing illness. And I find it quite useful to think about with chronic pain, because chronic pain is heavily gendered in terms of people with diagnoses of chronic pain. It tends heavily towards women. And I kind of want to flag there that basically means cis women, in that there are no figures. We do not know if there is a higher incidence of chronic pain amongst trans people than non-trans people. So whenever any of that, so it's a really, really complicated area. Once you start getting into chronic pain and gender is messy.
So to summarize, a very medicalized definition of women is
yes.
Okay, cool. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, you're looking at around 2/3 of people living with chronic pain are women. There seems to be a kind of a higher incidence of trans folk within that, maybe, but it's that we just don't have kind of large scale statistical data in that sense. It's not collected, it's not known. But anyway, so the undocumented idea is really, really useful because there is a history and a tendency of medicine to ignore women. And this is a fairly well documented thing. People don't believe women when they come to the doctor and say they're in pain or there is something else wrong. And crip theory and disabilities theories more broadly is really interested in the why do we not believe people question. Why do we not see people as experts in their own lives? And kind of thinking about how we can re-center people as experts in their own lives. But I find the word undocumented really, really useful because it kind of implies that actually it's not always about whether or not somebody knows they're in pain or somebody knows that they're ill or disabled. It's about whether or not other people recognize them as such. So crip theory changing how we shape or understand pain. This is kind of where my research goes, is thinking about what do we mean by pain? And one of the big things that I argue and is borne out in my research is that we have a very heavily medicalised understanding of pain. We think of pain in very medical terms, and pain is bad is kind of the shorthand way of saying it. We assume that pain is a negative experience. Either it's something that is telling us that it's wrong, or it's a sign of damage or injury. And it's above all something that we shouldn't want. So we shouldn't want to be in pain. And if we're doing something and we experience pain, that's probably a sign that we're doing something wrong. Obviously, that gets very, very complicated when you're talking about BDSM, but it gets also very complicated when it comes to thinking about chronic pain. And obviously there's a subset there of times when pain is either considered part of or necessary. So I'm thinking kind of the big one that tends to come across is some particular sports and gyms, and the idea of the no pain, no gain idea. That is, but again, we can think about the fact that the pain is situated as a negative still, while the positive in the sense of it's the kind of the final goal. It's also not something that
it's not a
that is really
process.
Kind of embraced or wanted.
It's a necessary evil to a greater good. To perhaps simplify it again, but I see what you mean.
No, necessary evil, it kind of works as well. Actually, we can think about the same way of childbirth is a big one, and getting tattoos tends to be the other one. It's something that you experience, but it's not necessarily a positive experience in and of itself. It's more about the end product or the end goal.
That's really interesting, because I think that ties into one of the conversations, just to kind of draw a quick link from an earlier episode where I'm talking about, I think the first episode with Operation Spanner and the idea of scarring, but like things like piercings, right? We're literally punching holes in. As someone who's recently got their nose pierced, like as of 2 weeks ago, like it was painful, but like, and it's not something I would do just on a day-to-day basis. But I mean, I've got 4 tattoos on me, and every single one of them, I wouldn't say any of them were pleasant experiences. But again, I see what you mean in the fact that we choose to experience that pain for an endpoint. So no, that I just wanted to make that connection there. But
and it's also interesting because you hear discussions of, should you take painkillers before you go and get tattooed, or is it natural birth is kind of one of the other ones of are you somehow doing yourself a disservice if you take painkillers while giving birth? And obviously, that's a very personal decision, but also, what? It's one of those ones I just don't get it. I'm afraid.
I was looking at, because I was saying I got my nose piercing. When I was looking online, people were saying an old traditional remedy to help ease the pain of childbirth is to get a nose piercing, which was one I've not heard, and I was like, oh, okay.
I'm going to kind of flag this up as something to put a pin on later. A running joke in some of my research with one of my interviewees was the phrase, we should get spanking on the NHS, because he's mostly thinking about the ways in which people using chronic pain and using pain to manage chronic pain. I can totally see getting your nose pierced as a distraction from childbirth.
It's like a joke my dad used to do. Sorry, Dad, if you're listening. he used to, it was a joke to clarify as well. I'd say I'd have a headache, so it would stamp on my foot. And I'd be like, what the hell was that for? He's like, we're not thinking about your head anymore. I was like, he was right. You know what I mean? Like, okay.
And it's so, yeah, we couldn't. So, I mean, on a kind of a very, very biological level, pain comes from a lot of places, and medicine doesn't really understand pain. And I'm not saying that sociologists understand it much either, but medicine doesn't understand where pain comes from in as well as we might think it does. And we tend to think of pain in terms of kind of two dualisms. And like I say, crip theory is really interested in those dualisms and those binaries. The first is chronic and acute. Acute pain is short-term temporary pain. Your dad stood on your foot. You got your nose pierced. That's acute pain. It's short. It's going to stop. Chronic is the opposite. It is continued for a long time. It has no prospect of stopping. And there is actually a medical definition of chronic pain, and it is pain that has been present. Well, it doesn't have to be continuous. It can be remitting, cyclical pain, but pain that has been present for more than 8 weeks for some definitions and 12 for others. So the slight disagreement between different medical bodies.
Yeah. Okay, great. Lovely consensus then on medical definitions.
Yeah. So some people, 8 weeks is generally, it's a pretty decent amount of time. It's 2 months. And the reason why menstrual pain doesn't count as chronic pain is because it doesn't last long enough within that. You have to be in pain for a certain proportion of those days, which kind of sounds slightly bizarre, but it's thinking about kind of pain as an everyday or more or less constant. Chronic and acute is the first one. And the other one is we tend to think of pain as mental or physical. We have a mind-body dualism. For those who are into the philosophies and things like that, it's a Cartesian dualism is the phrase you see a lot. But basically, we have the idea that pain is mental. So it comes from stress, or grief is quite often thought to be as painful, or it's physical, it's from injury.
So I was going to say, I think then to kind of, you've mentioned kind of BDSM and spanking and so on. And I'm aware that the question I'm about to ask falls very much into the dualisms that you've just raised as kind of critiquing it. BDSM, I mean, you talked about spanking on the NHS. That is, by this definition, what you'd call an acute pain, right? It's also, I would argue, a voluntary pain, in as much as in a good BDSM kind of scenario, you should be able to be free to leave at any point. Whereas of living with chronic pain, that there isn't the opportunity to go, right, I've had enough now, and drop it and go. So I'm kind of interested, how does BDSM as a kind of an acute form of pain and a willingly engaged with acute form of pain change the way that someone with chronic pain might experience or think through pain more specifically?
So within my research, which was looking specifically at long form interviews over the course of 18 months of people who have chronic pain, who engage in pain within BDSM practice, you can kind of see there were multiple reasons why they did it. Some people might have been into BDSM before they became chronically pained, so they were still into it. That was a thing that they enjoyed. Chronic pain wasn't for them a reason to not do it. For some, it was, and this is where spankings on the NHS comes in, they found the acute pain of spanking or flogging, any form of pain, was a temporary form of pain relief. Acute pain, particularly from injury, however temporary or voluntary, whether, piercing your nose or getting spanked, releases endorphins. It makes us feel good. We get a rush. It's the same rush that we get from exercise. So they were finding it kind of good in the form of its pain relief. That may or may not have been their first reason to get into it, but they were finding it useful. So they went, oh yeah, this is interesting and fun. Let's follow this. Let's see where it goes. And then the other ones were people who were using BDSM and particularly pain within kink as a kind of a way of reframing how they felt about their bodies. Chronic pain and living with chronic pain can be very, very distressing for a whole host of reasons. The biggest ones that my participants were talking about, and these are ones that I've experienced myself as well, are people just don't believe you, that it bloody well hurts, and that's not fun. And then also that you kind of feel a loss of sense of control over your body. And sometimes within disability studies, we use the phrase body mind, and you see it within disability activism as well. So you feel a loss of control over yourself. This is in particular because chronic pain quite often goes in hand with chronic fatigue. Pain is exhausting, and it means that you can't do the things that you used to be able to do. That might be, so for example, I can't work as long as I used to be able to. Or, I know people who had to give up work, or people who've had to give up activities that they enjoyed because they just no longer have the energy to do that. And BDSM for some of my participants was a way back into connecting with their bodies. So, on a very kind of literal and visceral level of doing something that they felt.
Can I just jump in? Because I think you kind of got me thinking here. Yeah. You talk about this idea of this feeling of like lack of control over the body. Now, to me, that the immediate connection that came to me there was kind of the thrill of a sub or a dom relationship. The idea of a sub giving over control as part of a relationship there, and by this I mean, depending on obviously who you're talking to, that could be like financial control, physical control, mental control, etc., etc. It could be sensory control, depending on what you're kind of engaging with, of course. So I think there's something really interesting there about that. And the question I wanted to ask was, and maybe you don't have an answer, is out of the people that you were speaking to, is there a tendency for people living with chronic pain to lean towards either more sub or more dom?
I don't know. I was speaking particularly to people who were identifying as either as subs or switches, because there were people who received pain. People who identify as exclusively dominant are just not going to be receiving pain. They're going to be the ones giving it out.
But I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting that your research there at least definitely shows there is a connection between sub and receiving pain, and as that voluntary action versus otherwise.
And some of the people I spoke to who were switches said that they felt less willing to cause people pain once they themselves became chronically pained, but not all of them. It's very much a site of negotiation. And I would say that in terms of the kind of control and giving it up, it's worth remembering that even within that giving up of control within a submissive dominant relationship, there are very clear boundaries, or there should be, ideally, clearly negotiated and set up boundaries of how much control and for how long, and what that loss of control or giving up of control can look like. And that in itself can be a form of control. Ultimately, the person in control of the situation is the sub, because they're the one who's going to say the safe word.
Exactly. I was just thinking that negotiation is a form of control, isn't it? It's even to take it to a really extreme element, things like, and I'm not making this connection with chronic pain, but rape fantasies. In dom, sub and BDSM circles, it's known as CNC, which is consensual non-consent. So there's even the boundary there, because the second you fully lose control, as in those boundaries are no longer respected, it stops being a healthy BDSM relationship, doesn't it?
Yeah. And that parallel actually works really well, because it's that saying of, I will experience pain for so long in this way, in this body part. People who experience chronic pain might, for example, go, well, I can be spanked, but I can't be flogged because my back hurts too much, or that particular position is one that I can't hold.
Or people who, like, for example, even people without experiencing chronic pain or living with chronic pain, they might say, for example, they're really into spanking, but not, for example, cock and bull torture, or hair pulling, or biting, or any combination of any sort of form like that. Okay.
Yeah, or being spanked with this particular implement is fine, but we're not going to go with a rod, we're going to go with a flogger, or we're going to go with a a leather paddle rather than a hat or a hand. And that's a really careful negotiation. And in some ways, some of my participants were finding that actually a really empowering thing. And I use the word empowering in the sense that what it meant is that they gained a sense of control over pain, but also they were able to think about pain. So living with chronic pain, and this is something that I hadn't realised I do until one of my participants brought it up. Living with chronic pain is an exercise in pushing pain away. Anyone who's stubbed their toe will know this. Pain just distracts you from everything else. It's impossible to think and do and engage in the world. So people living with chronic pain spend a lot of time not thinking about being in pain. And BDSM, for some of my participants, was a space to deliberately go, right, now I'm going to think about my body and I'm going to think about how much it hurts, but in a space that is really welcoming of those discussions. And I want to kind of expand that out and think about disability and BDSM, because a lot of disabled people have said the same thing, that they find the focuses on consent and of negotiation and discussion of bodily capacities and limits and preferences really, really useful. Because it's, if you're thinking about, I need, for example, a partner who is willing to lift me out of my wheelchair into the bed, or a partner who knows that they are deaf or blind and what that means when they're having sex. Whether that's sex in a most vanilla sense or BDSM, it still requires a certain amount of engagement with what can your body do and what can your body not do. And on top of that, disabled people have said that they find BDSM communities, saying kind of BDSM communities very broadly speaking, more welcoming because there is that space for talking about bodily diversity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's that kind of negotiation being the norm in a healthy BDSM community. It's not an unusual conversation, whereas I remember a friend of mine who is a wheelchair user and does have carers constantly, 24 hours a day, wanting to experience bottoming, and a lot of the kind of very difficult and uncomfortable conversations that took place with his carers and how to kind of prepare for that and then find people and friends or sexual partners who were prepared to take over that role of caring in those short scenarios, be it something as simple as being aware of his body and his limitations, or literally, as you said, just like lifting him out of his wheelchair. I think there is something there, as you said, in the BDSM community that allows us to have those negotiations in a more, it is the norm. I just wanted to kind of lean into this kind of idea, because I completely understand what you're saying. This is someone's opportunity to go, no, I'm going to engage with pain on my terms, basically. That's kind of how I've understood a lot of what you're saying. Yeah. This is where I'm retaking the control of how I'm dealing with this pain, as it were. And I kind of wanted to kind of look at this idea of, you mentioned earlier that we read pain equals bad, right? So how can we reframe that, or can we, as pain is not bad in a kind of a chronic sense? Because the positiveness of the pain in these kind of BDSM scenarios is because you're engaging with pain on your own terms, and one's own terms is the bit that makes that positive. Is it possible to, I guess, live with chronic pain and engage with pain in a positive way, bearing in mind, I know you can't speak for everyone and so on?
So yeah, on that, it is really difficult, because the social pressure of pain is bad is everywhere. It's one of the kind of the deepest, it's one of the kind of, it's completely pervasive, to the point where, even people within BDSM, masochists don't always like talking about, they quite often will say, it's not about the pain.
So just to clarify, when we say masochist, we mean people who enjoy having that pain inflicted on them,
pain or humiliation. Yeah. Masochists and submissives who so it's not about the pain, or I don't really like the pain, but there's quite often, even within kink, a disavowal of pain, as opposed to kind of all the stuff that goes with it, like humiliation or control. So the best parallel is that, getting a tattoo. You don't like getting a tattoo because it hurts. You like the tattoo because of what it means, or the end product. There's a kind of the assumption is that somebody who is submissive or masochistic or both doesn't enjoy being in pain. They enjoy giving up control. They enjoy the humiliation. They enjoy the negotiation of the power differential.
Of which pain is a kind of, I don't want to say byproduct, but just part and parcel of the experience, as it were.
Yeah, the point is not to be in pain. The point is to be humiliated or to give up control, or whatever the scene is thought to be. And within people who, dominance and sadists will say, oh, well, I don't like the idea of hurting somebody. I wouldn't do that if somebody didn't like it, or if they didn't consent to it. It's a very rare person who will put their hand up and go, yeah, no, actually, I like it because it hurts. And getting somebody very masochistic or very submissive in their approach to kink, getting them to go, no, I like that it hurts, is a really difficult thing, and not everyone does like that it hurts, and that's okay too.
Yeah, of course. I'm thinking in my mind, the conversation that was going in there, building on previous episodes, is this kind of the idea of the fisting, right? Pain for many people involved in fisting, especially early on, is part and parcel of it. But I don't think the pain is necessarily. Pain isn't necessarily it. I mean, because there are many other ways to experience pain without putting a fist up there in its crudest way. But it's not the person I interviewed, but someone else I was speaking to. They say one of the things they really enjoy is, to use their terminology, is they enjoy the stretch, and they enjoy the kind of slightly painful feeling that comes with the stretch. And that makes me think of that no pain, no gain kind of thing. It's the pushing their body to that limit that they're enjoying in that way. Yeah, I think there's something interesting there about the kind of someone else doing it to them. And I guess the bit I'm trying to get to here is, I'm thinking out loud here, is this kind of connection between acts that are seen as taboo in kind of a sexual sense, and then pain being part of that taboo. As you said, people don't like going, actually, the pain is what turns me on. The pain is what this, and it is often, I think you're right. I think they exist, but I do think it is a rare person, as you said, who's like, no, pain is what I want.
And I'd also say that, some of that social pressure and social construction of pain is bad, is why we say things like, I like the stretch, or I like the burn. And we're trying to almost find ways of saying that it hurts without saying it hurts. Our language around pain is very, very complicated, and the ways we talk about it and express it and hear it as well is very, very difficult. One of the kind of to return to chronic pain, one of the biggest problems that people with chronic pain have is being heard, is being listened to, and feeling that they're not being listened to. And I would say that is because pain is hard to listen to. It's hard to listen to others being in pain. We don't really enjoy that sensation, but it's also then hard to think about pain because we assume that pain is not fun, is not good. We're uncomfortable with it. It's a deep discomfort. And again, one of my participants, I think it's deeply telling that most of my insight has come from the things my participants have said. It's nothing that I've come up with. It's all stuff that they've said. It is the idea of pain as a bodily fluid, in the same way that urine and feces and blood is. People don't like hearing about pain because they're afraid it's going to get on them, was how they put it. In the same way that, and this ties to some really fab researcher called Jen Slater and another called Kirsty Lydiard, who've done some work around containment and particularly bodily fluids. It's actually, I found that their work is a really useful way of thinking about pain, because we have norms about expressing our bodily fluids. We go to the toilet in particular places, and straight women like to, turn the hairdryer on when they're going to go for a poo, because, heaven forbid that anyone know that they actually defecate. And pain is the same way. We don't talk about it. We don't, for people who are having period pains, they don't say, I want to go home because I'm in pain. They say, I want to go home because I'm not feeling well, or it's my time of the month.
It's all euphemistic descriptions of pain.
Yeah. And the last thing we'll ever admit to is that we're in pain and we just don't like it and we just don't want to be with people because it hurts. And there's something quite radical about that. So having pain and expressing pain and then somebody else listening to it is a really difficult thing, because our automatic assumption is to euphemize it, to downplay it, to find another word for it. And if we say ow or it hurts or words to that effect, the people listening to it aren't necessarily comfortable. And that was kind of one of the things for a lot of my participants, is they were saying that BDSM kink space scenes and play gave them a space to talk about that pain in ways that were welcoming and to be heard and recognised as in pain.
Yeah, so the way you said this made me think of this kind of discomfort that we experience with pain and this kind of uncomfortableness that came up. It made me think of an experience I had, and maybe I'm oversharing here, maybe we'll edit this out, but of a sexual experience I was having a long time ago, actually, years ago. And without going into too many details, the person I was involved in was asking me, he wanted me to, first of all, engage in race play with him, racial slurs, which made me very uncomfortable to begin with. But I actually drew a line on how far I was comfortable exploring some of those
boundaries,
because I was just like, I'm just not comfortable with that. But we also explored a few other things, including impact play. So people who don't know what that means, that would mean like not slapping, but like closed fist, punching, frankly. And to a certain extent, I was okay to play with that. But I remember he specifically asked at one point to, and I said no, very deliberately, very hard, punch him in his nose. And I remember thinking, no. Like, first of all, no, I don't want to inflict that pain. I mean, and I was kind of newer to these kinds of experiences at this time as well. So I was already pushing my comfort zone far. I remember thinking, no, because if I hit you as hard as I can in the nose, I will break your nose. And aside from the immediate, I don't want to have to deal with blood and broken bones, and I will have to take you to the hospital, no doubt. I remember thinking, no, that's going to fuck up your face for years. And I think there's something really interesting there, and to get to the point I'm trying to get to, about the pain that we are prepared to inflict, whether or not that would be acute or have a long-lasting, I don't want to say chronic because I don't think it would fit in that, but like a long-lasting impact. 10 years down the line, you can still tell if someone's had a broken nose, particularly if, as he asked me, and I do genuinely think he was 100% serious in the request, to hit him in the nose as hard as I could. I remember thinking, who would actually do that? Hit someone that hard and derive a level of pleasure from that. And I'm sure there are people out there, and I'm be clear, I'm not kink shaming, but this was very much way out of my comfort zone. And thinking about what made me comfortable or uncomfortable in that, and where my own boundaries in my own experiences, which will be different for the people, was kind of really interesting in the conversation that you had. Because that would have been pain for potentially months, or if I did do it and I did some serious damage, potentially problems years down the line with things like breathing properly through his nose and sense of smell. And
yeah, you can do some real damage to somebody punching them in the nose. If you get it just the right angle, you can potentially kill somebody. Punching people in the face is not a good idea generally.
Queer Disrupt do not condone punching people in the face as a general rule of thumb.
Yeah, it is, and it is about that level of comfort with causing pain. And like I say, one of my participants saying that their own chronic pain made them less willing to cause other people pain because we think of pain as bad. And to kind of return back to what you were saying about, is there a space for pain as not bad or pain in positive ways? I think there needs to be space where we can engage with pain as neutral. And some of the kind of the thinking around this has actually, some of the ideas around, I'm sure you've heard of body positivity and fat liberation, but also
just on the off chance our listeners haven't, could you just give me a 2-sentence summary?
That being fat is okay. The idea is that being in pain needs to be okay. It doesn't have to be a good thing. It just is. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It is. So body neutrality is, rather than trying to aim for people to have a kind of a loving and a celebratory approach to their bodies is to just go, my body is, and that's it. It's kind of, it's not good, it's not bad, it's value neutral. And that, I think, is actually a really useful goal and a really useful approach to thinking about pain, because pain is so value laden. Once we start to we don't have to aim to be celebrating it. And that's going to be a really difficult and uncomfortable thing for a lot of people. So just neutral. It just is. There might be things that you can do to minimize it. There might be things that you can do to get rid of it. But it is. And therefore, maybe it's not about living without pain, it's living with pain.
It's a kind of...
And that kind of...
There's no value ladenness to existing any more than any other human being, or less than any other human being. We just are. So you're talking about this idea of body neutrality, right? As a kind of an adjacent or an alternative or alongside this kind of body positivity there. But I think people who perhaps thinking of the kind of body positivity movement are perhaps thinking about it in the same way as perhaps pride is for queer people, or at least the way that I view it. It's not necessarily that I am proud of being queer, but the pride part is to counteract the shame. So for the body positivity movement, is a lot of it's particularly around larger bodies, or bodies that are kind of regarded as obese or fat or whatever terminology you want to use, medicalised or otherwise. Is not body positivity there to counteract that kind of negativity? You're talking about kind of body neutrality and pain as neutrality. Is there not a pain as positivity to counteract pain as negativity?
Yeah. And I think there's definitely space within. I mean, there's disability pride as well. Disability Pride Month was last month. July is Disability Pride Month. So yeah, there is that, and pride as counter to shame is definitely an important part of that. But this is for me again where crip is really, really useful. It's one thing to say, to counter the shame of one's body if you're fat, like I am myself, or if you are queer or gender non-conforming or any other kind of, or living in a racialized identity as well. Pride as counter to shame and stigma is really, really important. But with pain in particular, because pain is so negative and chronic pain hurts, it's not fun. There is no, it's really, really hard to find joy in it. And I think there has to be a certain aspect of pleasures in pride. And I'm using the term pleasures really, really broadly here, whether it is pleasures of an act, pleasures of sensation, pleasures of selfhood, pleasures of community and of being recognised as a member of a community. Those are all counteracting shame. Pain, like a lot of other bodily fluids here, it's really, really hard to kind of get through that and get into pride. And being proud of being in pain, of pain, of vomit, of urine and feces is difficult. So sometimes bodily neutrality is pride, because it's saying I'm not ashamed of it, I'm not rejecting it, but it's not a source of joy for me, and it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, and that's okay.
It doesn't have to be some. Yeah, it's also okay to have a really complicated and messy relationship with it.
Yeah, I was thinking about myself, but in the way you were describing that, in terms of how I embrace my non-binary identity, there are very specific ways that I kind of embrace, particularly the more feminine parts of me. And often that's expressed very much through kind of a hyper-feminized drag that I do. My drag, although I don't look at feminized drag as my research, I do engage in that, partially because that is a mechanism for me to kind of explore that. And the reason this came to mind here is because this kind of BDSM relationship that some people have, perhaps a form, for want of a better phrase again, of pain pride, in much the same way that drag for me is, I guess, femme pride. For those who don't know me, society would read me as male, and society would read me as masculine presenting. I wear male clothes for the most part, or whatever these terms mean. No, I wear clothes. They're my clothes. But society reads me as male, and there's a level of discomfort that I have sometimes presenting as kind of male Nick in feminine presentation. So I almost take it into a safer space, and that safer space for me is this drag performance where I do wear 1 foot tall wigs and 8-inch heels and tight dresses, and it is, and I say this in the full awareness that it is not representative of real life femininity. It is not. It's a representative of society's understanding or society's belief of what femininity is. And in a certain way, it mocks that. And in doing so, I'm coming to terms with my own non-binary neutrality, as a want of a better phrase. God, this was like therapy. This turned into a therapy session. I love it. Wow. No, that's a really interesting way of thinking through it.
So, to kind of to go off the drag thing, it's a kind of, it's a deliberate playing with, and I do use the word playing with pain. One of the few, when I first started my PhD, I was doing one of the few books I could find on disability and BDSM was called Playing with Disability. As a book, it's not great, but it's quite problematic. But it's a really interesting series of first-person accounts of disabled people who engage with their disability in their BDSM. So, for example, a hearing impaired guy who played with other forms of sensory deprivation and what it meant to that person to have sensory deprivation when they were already considered to be sensorily deprived in some way. Or there was another one that was really interesting. It was about somebody who was an amputee playing with and engaging, using their mobility aids within play. And I am sure some of your listeners will have heard the artist Bob Flanagan and his use of, known by the name of a super masochist. He passed away more than a few years ago now. He used medical play and BDSM play more broadly, medical play in particular, within his own private play, but also within his performance art, to explore through his feelings and his experiences of cystic fibrosis. The use of BDSM to think through bodies and embodied experiences is nothing new.
I will put a pin in that, much as that is genuinely a fascinating conversation. Lots of ideas here about this kind of the idea that one must control. Pain must be a restrained feeling, a restrained body thing. Imagining it as a bodily fluid, it has to be contained in some sort of neat, abstract box. Otherwise, the pain will get everywhere and it'll be scary, and people don't want that, and that's worrying.
But also, to think on that no pain, no gain, it's acceptable to feel pain in that situation because you're doing something healthy.
And it's controlled, isn't it? Because it's a very specific type of pain. If you're working on your arms and all of a sudden your ankle gives way, that's bad pain. But feeling a pain in your bicep, it's lactic acid, it's pain. So again, even there, it's an exceptionally controlled pain, isn't it?
So it's for me, those kind of controlling of pain ties into broader discourses around health and health as a moral imperative, which is a reflection of ableism. And that's where, to tie back to, that's where crip theory starts to come in and go, well, what do we mean by healthy?
Well, I think that's a really good question, because one of my questions I had to kind of, I guess, go back to this BDSM idea, and I don't necessarily think there is an answer. We talk about, and I would say problematic discourses about pain and that boundary of pain in terms of what is permittable in BDSM relationships. No, I won't break someone's nose, to use my example there. But in doing so, there's an idea there that I am taking that agency of inflicting pain away from the person who wants that done. Now, my example is perhaps quite an extreme example. And of course, I would never say that anyone is obliged to inflict pain on someone if they don't want to. But I think there is an interesting discussion there about how one's understanding of pain shifts to the point of, at some point we go, you can't consent to that. And there's an agency being removed there. And again, and this is, of course, a massively extreme example. There was the German cannibal from years back. A man consented to basically being killed and eaten. A vast majority of people would go, yeah, that's a step too far. but what point do we have that step too far? At what point does something cross over to go, actually, you can't consent to that anymore for whatever reason? And that relationship to pain, and how does that change when someone does experience chronic pain or issues that change the scope of the boundaries of discussion around consent in particular, and consent about inflicting and enduring pain or difficulties?
So yeah, I think the example you gave of the German cannibal is a really interesting one, because it is that thing of when can someone consent. You can consent to your body being used for medical research after you die, but can you consent to being eaten after you die? If he died of natural cause, I tend to go off on a complete. If he died of natural causes, would he consent? Could he consent to being eaten then? I mean,
there's weird kind of contextual things, like when people have been stranded in like plane crashes and they've eaten dead bodies to survive, and which again, those sounds what we're going on, but again, like, that's acceptable in that case, or is it? But I think more people would say that's more acceptable than someone going, actually, yeah, you can kill me and eat me. Like, so, yeah. So where what on earth are these boundaries, and how are they drawn?
Chronic pain and saying to someone, okay, right, so you're in pain and I'm going to cause you more pain. Your instinctual is no, I'm not going to do that. Thanks, but no. Consent and agency issue of when can someone consent to a thing is a really, really complicated one, and a really, really, for want of a better phrase, individual thing. And consent more broadly, to think around some of the thoughts around disability, and disability and sexuality talks about consent a lot. Can, for example, learning disabled people consent to sex? One of the cases I discuss quite a lot is because, of course, you start to think it's not just norms of sex, but norms of sexuality and gender. There was a case, and it's a good few years ago now, of a young man living in supported living because he had a learning disability, and he wanted to have his sexual partner come and visit, his romantic partner as well, come and visit him and engage in sex, because, that was a fun thing they did together. The people running the supported living facility that he was living in, his carers, weren't happy with it and banned because they are able to do so because he isn't considered legally doesn't have legal capacity. They banned his partner from visiting. And it went to court, and the judge decided in the favour of the care facility, because the judge said that the young man in question couldn't explain why he needed to use condoms to protect against pregnancy. The young man wasn't able to articulate it. The problem was that the young man in particular was gay, and so his partner was a cis man himself, and he was perfectly able to articulate the fact that he needed to wear a condom to protect against STDs.
Right. I didn't know where that was going, but that was not the twist I expected. But
that's what I mean.
Really
so he was considered unable to consent to sex because he wasn't able to explain the use of condoms to prevent pregnancy.
To summarize that, what you're saying there is the judge is going, you aren't able to explain the use of a condom in a very specific, in this case, heteronormative cis framework. Therefore, you are not capable. And of course,
of consent.
Yeah, of consent. And of course, what I think is being said there, actually, that the framework was wrong in the first place for him in this particular case, because actually he was able to articulate the relevant information.
I would add, I'm going to apologise now, the cat is going to purr. He has
okay.
the world's as loud as an aggressive purr.
Okay.
But if I shut him out, he will cry.
So we're having a purring cat from now on, it's fine.
Yeah, sorry about this. His
name
I can
is Bob. Hear him. I can actually hear him. Wow, he is really loud. Okay, sorry, go on.
I would add that in that particular case, it was overturned. The judge's decision was overturned on appeal because it was very clearly explained to the judge that heteronormative framework here, etc. I was thinking when you were explaining it is about asking those questions, because if you say to somebody, "Do you engage in high risk sexual activities?" I mean, what
does high risk even mean? Is high risk for you the same as high risk for me? And the question they were asking, obviously, in that case was, do you engage in activities that may cause a very specific type of
injury?
Yeah,
or a very particular consequence in the form of pregnancy, or a high risk activity may or may not be easily defined. And so, you do need to almost see the logic and go, do you engage in fisting? Because if you name the behaviour, that's an easier question sometimes. But they almost need a list of, do you engage in any of these things that could result in micro tears? And those aren't confined to gay people or to people who are engaging in anal sex. And this is kind of with chronic pain, this is where consent and agency does become about those individual conversations of saying somebody can consent to a particular form of pain, particular amount of pain, And that is an individual's decision. And it may be that they have a partner who's going, actually, I'm not comfortable causing you that pain. And that has to be okay too, because not everyone is comfortable causing pain. And even outside of a BDSM situation, sex can be painful, even when it's enjoyable, or the consequences of it. So to kind of go with my experience of chronic pain, and which for me goes hand in hand with chronic fatigue, and for not everyone it does, but that's this particular form of where my disability sits. That in a lot of the pain and fatigue management is a lot of this emphasis on doing things that reduce your pain, or not doing things that cause you to be in more pain. And one of the most freeing things I kind of discovered was that actually I didn't have to just do things that would minimize pain and fatigue. I could go and do something deliberately knowing that it was going to hurt like hell or exhaust me. And that was okay, because I could make that choice. I knew that going to a gig and dancing for several hours was going to knacker me out for several days after. And I still go and do it.
Because it's your
A,
right
it brings
to do
me
it.
pleasure, and B, I can. But other people have been very uncomfortable with that. And sometimes I have to have those conversations with people that goes, well, why are you uncomfortable with it? And what is it about me doing this thing that is making you unhappy or uncomfortable that you think that I shouldn't do it? And for me, that same conversation of consent, of what can I do with my body mind, and what can I know that I can do that somebody else may not be comfortable with, but can I talk to them about it? And is the thing that I want to do something that I can articulate? When it comes to chronic pain, disability, more learning disability, sometimes it requires a different shift in how we listen, to think about the frameworks that we're listening through. To think about that case, are we thinking in a heterosexual framework? Are we thinking in terms of the communicative norms that someone can and cannot communicate in a normal way? And I'm using scare quotes here around the phrase normal, because I hate the phrase normal. So to go back to what I'm saying is that idea of consenting to pain as a chronically pained person is a very difficult thing. But that doesn't mean that because you're in pain, you can't consent to more pain.
It makes me think of, again, a conversation, and just to very quickly say, the fact that I was in full drag for Pride weekend and I chose to stay out for 18 hours in 7.5-inch heels, in the full awareness that, my God, it's Thursday now, it's been 5 days and my feet still hurt. But
yeah,
I think it's interesting that no one seemed to, when I said, I know this is going to happen, everyone went, oh, okay, but they wouldn't necessarily summon it. So I think there's a really interesting negotiation on who is allowed permission to allow their own body to experience pain. And for whatever reason, by the sounds of it, in your experiences, that people have sometimes been uncomfortable with you reclaiming that permission on the pain that you experience. But no one would ever question that with me in drag. Drag is sometimes painful, and they go, oh, okay, yes, but you do it and you enjoy it, and that's okay. Like, why is it more okay for me to adopt that, but not, for example, yourself?
And it's, in those two cases, they can be a myriad of things, from gender, age, what you're doing. Maybe they would have had a different response if it hadn't been Pride weekend.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because in this particular case, drag currently has an extremely high profile. I am read as a white male, all of these things. And I think that there is, taken into all of these kind of different intersections of oppression and privilege here, I think that also plays a very large part of it as well.
Yeah. And it is about that negotiation of what can you do with your body, and who gets to have that agency. And to kind of pull it back to where we were going of what is disability studies, that's one of the big questions, is who gets to say that their body is capable of doing these things, and who gets to have authority over their selfhood, I think is a nice way of phrasing it.
So just to wrap up, because I have one last question that I think is an interesting and I think an important question. It should lead on from our previous conversations that I've had in other episodes about, like, how does it aftercare change in kind of BDSM when we're talking about people experiencing chronic? What's at play, and how do we understand aftercare and what that means, given these different frameworks we have to look at pain with?
So aftercare becomes very important. Aftercare is always important. say that very clearly. But particularly when you're encountering anything that is, it might be playing with disability, it might be playing with gender or race, or anything that might be to do with somebody's identity, that might require particular care in aftercare. Aftercare isn't just about physical care. And there is that kind of assumption that aftercare, when involving chronic pain, is going to be about physical care. Yeah, it becomes very important to think about, the pain is an emotional experience, even when that pain is primarily thought of in physical terms because it's pain from flogging or impact play. That pain it carries an emotional weight to it. So it's thinking about it, but it's also, again, about communicating of what does good aftercare look like. Chronically pained people are very good at pain management. We're very good at saying what we might need, and it might involve stronger painkillers than somebody. It might actually involve taking painkillers or a bath or application of ice packs and large volumes of Voltarol gel. And if that's what that person requires, then yeah, go for it. It doesn't mean that the pain hasn't been consented to, willingly and enthusiastically engaged with, and all the rest of those things. But it might mean that pain becomes a more immediate part of their aftercare as well. But then again, there are days when after a day of teaching, all I want to do is lie in a bath full of Voltarol gel. It's disgustingly sticky, but it won't hurt.
I would argue that a day of teaching is sometimes equivalent to a day-long BDSM session sometimes.
Feels very masochistic at times. For some of my participants, I know that their relationship to aftercare and what they needed out of their partners changed as their relationship to chronic pain changed, and whether or not they were playing with chronic pain. Again, it's about that ongoing discussion of what do they need, but also, again, recognising that they are the expert in their body mind, and therefore they might have ideas about what they need.
That's a really good answer. I think it's actually a really good place to kind of put, I think, a pause in the conversation. We've covered a lot. So we went into this with a kind of a list of kind of conversation prompts, and we've strayed wildly off of them as for our listeners. And I think it's been a really kind of productive and interesting conversation to have. And I hope you feel the same way.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting, productive conversation. There's opportunities of going back to some stuff that I haven't thought about for a little while. Really timely as well, because I'm trying to write this research up into a book. So I'm actually thinking about it again a bit more, feeling a bit more, oh yeah, this is a thing that I think about.
Okay, well, up there. Is there anything you wanted to shout out? Anything you wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, no, I always want to, whenever I'm doing this stuff, I always feel I should, and I always want to thank the people who spent 18 months talking to me and having very long conversations, who gave up lots of their time and energy. And when you've got energy impairments, that's a lot, to tell me about really personal stuff and have really personal conversations with me. And, sometimes also having very long conversations with me about my own experience of chronic pain and BDSM sometimes. There's less interview, more mutual catharsis. They taught me a lot. And yeah, I don't recommend doing a PhD as a way to become okay with your body, but
You're speaking to someone doing a PhD on drag.
I know, as a way of doing it. I don't recommend it as a starting idea, but that turned out as to be one of the big things I got out of mine, other than a title change, was a definite change in my relationship to my own anatomy and experience.
So with that, I just want to, myself, both personally, but also on behalf of Queer Disrupt as a group, thank you for spending, currently it's coming up to 2.5 hours, and I'm aware, as someone who is perhaps having chronic fatigue at the minute, it's a lot of energy and a lot of ask. I want to personally thank you for spending the time for us to share your fantastic and interesting thoughts on this, and your research, and giving a space for those you have interviewed, and giving that voice out there as well. So I guess with that, we'll wrap up, and thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been really good.
thank you all for listening to that. That is our final episode of our kind of pre-recorded ones. Next week, it'll be our final episode. I don't have a title yet at the time of recording, so who knows what it'll be called. But I shall hopefully, if all goes to plan, be speaking to Warwick Fetish Society, which is the student society at Warwick University. And we're going to be having a discussion reflecting on these previous 4 episodes. I'm very excited to hear what they think. I would love to be able to get some of your feedback as well before then, because I'd be interested to raise some of the conversations that you've raised in that with the group and have a discussion there. As always, all of our social medias down below in the show notes. And yes, I'm really hoping that you're enjoying this as much as I have. And I will catch you all next week for our final episode. And I hope you have a wonderful time.